Welcome to the Intune Training Show.
No. Do you want me to do it?
It's all good.
Okay.
Welcome to Intune Training, the Steve and Adam Show, with Ben and no Adam. How you going, Ben?
I'm going good, Steve. How are you?
I'm pretty good, buddy.
Excellent.
So what are we talking about today?
So today we're just going to, hopefully it's going to be a really quick one. We're going to talk about ways that we can create better dynamic groups in Intune, or for Intune rather. I know personally, every time I go to try and do dynamic groups, I get disappointed with the data that is available for filtering. And knowing why that's the case still doesn't make it better. So what I just sort of wanted to do with you is have a look at the current state of dynamic groups in Intune, and then look at ways that we can.
You mean AAD, right?
Sure, but it's Intune for the sake of Intune training, Stephen.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. And just sort of look at ways that we can complement that with tooling that is available for us specifically in the Power Platform and Flow, or Power Automate as it's now called.
Power Automate, yes.
Exactly. So with
We've
that
got
said,
our little jar sitting here every time we get it wrong.
We do, yeah, exactly. So with that, Steve, did you want to share your screen, and we'll just create a dynamic group now, and we'll just sort of talk about some of the reasons why it's a pain.
Cool. So here's my screen. Obviously, this is the Intune training tenant. We're going to go across the groups, and in here, if you haven't turned on the preview features, highly recommend it. Gives you a whole heap of additional features around search and sort. So always use that. There's also an additional hidden one in here. When you create a new group, it gives you the ability to assign Azure AD roles to a group. So this is your global admin and things like that. It has to be a new group, and it has to be an AAD group only to be able to do that feature.
Yeah.
Completely side tangent, but I thought it was important enough to discuss.
Definitely.
So we're going to call this our awesome group. And because I'm still a child, we're going to use emojis.
Excellent.
And we're going to change this to a dynamic device.
Yeah.
So under the device query, what we have in here is a whole heap of options. And we look at this and go, cool, there's some useful information where we can base it around manufacturer and model, is rooted. Obviously, that's an Android device, not somebody having fun with it. And we can break that into the device physical IDs, OUs, and things like that. But the important thing to call out here is, well, how do we know if the device doesn't exist? How do we get it into the dynamic group? Or if we're sitting there and saying, well, I want my devices that only have 120 gig storage in a group.
Yeah,
that information isn't captured here.
Exactly. Or things like, so we're looking at this data, and that's, there's a decent amount of things you can filter, fairly well on that. And I know I use these groups to do the famous ZTD ID catch-all group, which is fine. But if we want to start getting things from Intune, this is where we quickly realize, as you said at the start of this, is that this is actually from AAD. This kind of doesn't have anything to do with Intune. We can see it in Intune, but what we're really doing is we're creating groups in AAD. So we don't have the access to the Intune data to create the filtering rules on things like compliance or whatever else you really want to do. So this is where people immediately start going, well, I want to start creating dynamic groups based on these things. How can I do it? So this is sort of where this idea that Steve and I actually came up with last weekend. So I have a scenario currently in where I work, and I've actually run into it a lot with clients as well, where they want to be able to add devices to groups as soon as autopilot finishes, or once a specific event happens on that device. Now,
proactive remediation successful, application installed.
Exactly, pretty much. So right off the bat, we just don't have that functionality available to us in dynamic memberships. So we need to think outside the box, and that is where the Power Automate platform, or the Power Platform, comes into play. So I'm going to take the screen, Steve.
Yep, you do that.
Awesome.
And we're going to stress here, this is going to include a bit of coding in there, but as much of it as possible is going to be low code, no code scenario.
Yeah.
So I'll get you to zoom in just a little bit if you can, Ben.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm starting at the Intune portal. I just want to point out this is the magic trick. There's nothing up my sleeve scenario. So I've just created a group called app deploy example, and there's nothing in there. So in my scenario, I've got devices that have gone through autopilot, and say we've got a couple of applications assigned to this group. So any member of this group is going to get Notepad or Winamp or whatever your core business applications are that you don't specifically want to run through the ESP stage of autopilot. Cool. So there's nothing in here, but what we want to do is work on, okay, autopilot is complete. Now, we had quite a deep discussion over the weekend about like what's the best way to determine whether a device has actually completed autopilot, and we sort of settled on compliance.
And it's going to be controversial for a lot of people.
So right now, there's no real flag specifically that says device has completed autopilot, which would be great if that was a thing. But for now, we basically just need to go, what happens that we know happens after autopilot? And right now, the best one that we can come up with is, well, the device is compliant, because that can take a little while to happen. And in this scenario, I don't particularly care if it happens immediately after autopilot. I just want to happen sometime down the road within a day, realistically. And if your organization is all set up correctly, that compliance rule should always be working and all of your devices should be compliant. So it's a fairly easy one to use as an example.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we need to create the Power Automate flow. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you sort of how we make the connector to get the data that we need. So I'll pop over to AAD, and I'm going to go into Azure Active Directory. We've done this a million times, and hopefully everyone's well versed in this by now. But we're just going to go into app registrations. I'm just going to show you the configuration. So if we go into Intune compliance check, and the API permissions. So these are the permissions that we need to do what we're going to do. And as you can see here, there's actually not a lot. The key thing to point out is that we're doing application delegated API permissions. So we're looking for device read all and device management managed something. Managed devices read all.
Realistically, we can actually remove user.read.
Yes, this comes by default. So whenever you create an application, that's just default, but it's delegated, and because we're doing application, it doesn't do anything. So it's fine. So really what we're doing here is this read all gives us access to the Intune object. This read all gives us access to the AAD object. And as we've said many times on this channel, whenever you have an Intune device, you have two objects. You have the AAD object and the Intune object. And this again comes down to that idea that the dynamic groups are only really working with the AAD object, not the Intune object. So this is how we get around that.
Indeed.
Okay, so we've got that. We've got our application ID and we've got our client secret. So basically, if you haven't already done this, go in, you create a client secret, copy it, make sure it's kept secure, because this is basically access or keys to the kingdom. So once you've got your object, your application ID, and your client secret, we can then move on to Power Automate. Boom. Okay, I'm going to go into my flows. Now, I'm not going to create it from scratch because this will take a little while, but what we are going to do is we're going to make this available probably on GitHub somewhere. I'll just export this and chuck it up, and we'll put a link down below. Should be very easy to build off this, as well as modify each little segment to sort of customize to how you want to use this. So we'll go into my flows, and we've got a flow here called dynamically join group based on compliance. So let's just go in and have a look at how it's all configured. So at the moment, I've got it to manually trigger a flow, but what I would generally recommend is just deleting this and replacing it with a schedule, potentially running it once a day. It really just depends on how your sort of business scenario plays out. I've got a single, and this is something that I haven't shown Steve. I have a single task, what is it, action, called vars. In here, I have nothing. But I'm actually compiling and storing all of the data that I need to authenticate into my graph calls through, what are they called? Tracked properties. So the tracked properties, we've got the authority, tenant ID, audience, client ID, client secret, and the security group ID. So all this information is the stuff that I need to authenticate. These ones, this one and this one never change, so you can use that. The tenant ID is obviously either your tenant ID or the fully qualified of your domain. Client ID, client secret are what we just did in the AAD thing, and the security group ID is the ID of the security group that we want to add. It's all pretty self-explanatory. So now that we've got all that, we then go through a couple of steps. Now, the get group one isn't really necessary. We've already got the group ID, but we've got it in there anyway, just for validation, in case the group gets deleted accidentally or whatever. If we can't find it, this will fail, and it will just advise us that the flow has failed to run. The get group members is I just need to know who's currently a member of that group so that I can step through and make sure that we're not re-adding or adding devices to that group that are already a member, because it will fall over. The get past time is how I'm filtering this. So at the moment, I've got this set to 1 month. You can obviously set this however you want. As a rule, you'd probably want to scope it to like a week.
Or an hour.
Yeah, or an hour. An hour's a bit much. Maybe a day, a week.
It all comes down to how often you run the trigger.
Exactly. But the important thing is that regardless of the scope that you're filtering, if the devices are already in that group, they're not going to get re-added. So there's no harm in opening up that filter. It's just sort of constraining the data that we get back. So I'm just going to keep it back to a month, just because we've only got so few devices in our environment that we kind of need that. And then we get onto the real meat of the process. So this is our first graph call that we're doing. I'm really sorry, this is small text, but again, we'll have all this available as a repo, so you can dig in later. So what we're doing here is we're doing a get to the beta endpoint device management, manage devices, and then we're filtering on enrolled date time is greater than our pass time. So as long as this device has been enrolled into our tenant within the last month, we're going to get that data. If we go into the advanced options, this is actually where we authenticate to graph. Because normally if we were doing this in PowerShell, we would have a function that stores that token. We can't really do that in Flow, so we just need to put that information here. So as you can see, this is all cool. So this is getting the data. Again, this is very small. I apologize, I can't make this much better. But it's just going actions. It's getting the vars. It's getting that tracked property, and that's it, right? So it's just stepping through so that the code is stored. You never need to reuse it. It's basically storing it as a variable.
Yep.
Doing the same thing.
Just saves you having to retype it every time. You can just change it in one place and away you go.
That's it, exactly. Cool. So we're doing that call, and then we need to do something with the data because Power Automate doesn't really know what to do with JSON. So we need to convert it basically into an object or an array. So what we do here is we just create this, and what we actually did is we ran this, and we get the resultant data, and then we generate from sample. We just paste that data in, and it generates the schema for us. This is very important. It's also very easy. So essentially, if you're doing this from blank, from nothing, you would get to this point, you would test it, you'd get the result, you then generate from sample, paste the data in, move on. Never need to think about it again. It is very easy. I actually quite like it. Okay, so once we've converted this data to something that Power Automate understands, we then step through the results. So in this scenario, I've got a virtual machine and Steve's got a virtual machine that were enrolled in our tenant in the last month. So I know right now, because I've done enough testing, that I'm going to get 2 results. If you had more, this would handle that. So we're just stepping through doing an apply to each. It's basically like a for each loop. We're doing that for each loop based on the value because the way that the graph data comes back, it has value and then an array of all of the values. I could spend a very long time talking about graph, but that is not the point of this video.
That's correct.
Okay, so once we've got that, what we're doing is we're creating a switch statement or a case statement based on the resulting data from value on the compliance state. This is the point of this whole thing. I want to know whether the device is compliant, not compliant, or unknown, which is the default state. So as soon as a device gets enrolled into our tenant, it will immediately fall over to unknown until it either is compliant or non-compliant. So we've put that information in. And what we want to do specifically is run an action on any devices that are compliant. Now, there is a scenario here that if it's not compliant, you could potentially reverse what we're doing and actually take the device out of the group. And there's real value in doing that.
Yep.
But for now, I've just left this blank because I don't care what happens down that tree or that branch. We just want to do compliant. So I'm going to pop in here. And this is actually, Steve, where I had the most problems.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, okay. So compliant, we're assuming that the device has come through the tree, it's got to the compliant branch. What we then need to do is, because up until this point, we've only been dealing with the Intune object, we need to get the device ID from this JSON object and then do another call to the AAD object. So again, graph microsoft.com beta devices, and then filter on the device ID, which equals the device ID that we get from that initial call.
The Azure AD device ID,
Yes,
not the
correct.
device ID. Two very different fields.
Exactly. So it's the Azure AD device ID. This will only ever return one object, but because of the inherent way that
The scheme is written,
we end up getting an array of value with one object. So that's actually the trickiest part. So what I did was again, you pass that JSON into an object that we can do, and then we apply to each. So it needs to step through because it sees value as an array, which you can see here. And then what we're doing is we're filtering that array from group members. So this is the, where are we? Group members here, which is just giving us the list of the current members of that group. And then we're saying, if the device ID is equal to the device ID, that's the result we want. So what I'm expecting here is not a Boolean value. It is just a result. I'm going to get a result. And what I filter, or what I do my condition on, which is like my if statement, is the length of this filter 0 or not? So if it's 0, that means that we didn't find a result, right? So
not
we're
a member.
filtering. Exactly, it's not a member. So yes. Yes means not a member. So what we're going to do then is we're going to add that to the group.
So we're going to add a user to a group?
Yeah, this is a weird one. So out of the box, there is no action in Power Automate that says add device to group. However, all it's really doing is adding a GUID that represents the ID of an object. And in this case, I don't care whether it's a user or a device, and neither does AAD, obviously. We're just getting the ID of the thing and adding it to the ID of the thing, the container. Yeah, it's very strange. We could rename that, right? We could go, let's do this, add device. So we can trick ourselves a little bit.
But the object that we've added there is add user to group.
That's correct.
Is the important call out.
That's right.
When you go looking at this later, look for add user to group, not add device.
Because it will not be
the same.
Exactly. And then finally, just for a little bit of
because we can
pizzazz, I've added a post the message as a Flowbot to the channel. Now, I haven't actually tested this as the Flowbot, so who knows what's going to happen. I've connected to the Intune training team. I created a channel called notifications. Very basically, I've just said, hey, device has been added to group. They should start getting associated policies and applications shortly. So it's really simple. There's nothing else to it. Again, all of the trees or all of the branches that I don't need to deal with right now are empty. So if anything falls down to that, it's not going to do anything. So if you were to use this in your organization, I would strongly suggest handling these things and doing things with it, whether you're sending out notifications or whatever. It's just good to have that verbosity to it.
Yeah.
All right, so we're just going to hit save. And as I said, we're doing this as a manually trigger. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to run it myself. So again, let's just confirm we've got no members in here. And we'll just go run.
And I'm not sitting here and going and manually adding
put
them.
your hands up. All right, so let's run this flow, and we'll just pop in and we'll watch it go through. So all of these are already done, and it's now just going through that for each loop. So it's very, very quick. And one thing that I didn't realize was a thing, Steve, was if I go into my HTTP call that I do, and
Yes.
look at the raw inputs,
Yes.
the secret is sanitized.
Yes, it is.
That's awesome. I was really, really excited about that. So the actual important data is never actually stored in the results. So, you can be somewhat secure in keeping this data.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
And there's our tick all the way through.
Yep, we've got a tick all the way through. Let's just jump into this and have a look. So compliant. All right. So this is the first result. It gets a little confusing, but we're applying to each. So we've got two results as expected. First one is compliant. The second one's also compliant. So we can walk through this tree. We grab the AAD object. We're getting that data. The ID is there. The AAD object result. Cool. We've also got that data. And finally, we apply the AAD object. We filter. And the condition was true. And then it hit this added device to group and posted a message to the Flowbot. So let's pop back over to Intune and we'll refresh this. Hey,
there's our two devices.
Check it out. We've got the devices there. Now this is really quick. And the I just think like the group refresh is a lot faster. Like it's actually live data now as opposed to cache data, which is really, really cool. Okay, so of these devices, one of those is mine. As part of this demo, theoretically, we could have assigned an application to this group and seen it come through, but that just takes a while. Understand the process is done, right? We've now dynamically created our own groups, and we can have this on a schedule, and it's always going to keep doing this for us. But I just want to show that.
The other thing to call out on that is you also have the ability to dynamically create a group. So if you've got a value tree that's sitting there and saying compliant, non-compliant, and unknown, technically you could sit there and if we added a fourth option there, you could have it go, well, I don't know this name. I'm going to go and create a group called this and go through that workflow.
Yeah, completely. It's as dynamic and as programmatic as you want. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So let's. I just want to go into Teams and just see if that notification came through because I'm curious.
Notifications.
Hey, it did. Sweet. Okay, so we got this is from a Flowbot. This is important because I initially did it and it was coming through as me, and I just want to show that this is completely independent of my account. Even though it's currently running as me, there are ways around that. But so just showing that we got the device, and I actually got the device name, not the ID, so it's a little more user friendly. So hey, the device was added to the app deploy example. They should start getting these associated policies. Interesting. It still says that I use Power Automate to send the notification. I'm guessing it's getting that data from because my account ran.
You triggered it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, so we got those two notifications. That's pretty much it. I just wanted to show that look, the state of dynamic groups at the moment is don't meet what people expect them in Intune, but there is a reason to that. And instead of getting down about it, just realize that the data that you want to use is there. You just need to spend a little bit of time to understand the Power Platform, or level up your PowerShell skills. It's all there. You can do this sort of stuff. And at least to help you off, we're going to put this up on GitHub so that you guys can import it, have a play around. One thing that I would be really interested in to hear from other people is, so we use compliance as our as our trigger. I'd be curious to know what other people think would be a good trigger for this. So, if you've got any other ideas, please leave comments below. But yeah, it's, this was really fun. This was a couple of days of work. Hadn't seen Steve in the flesh for a little while, so that was fun. And yeah, now we've got this working solution. And look, this is something that I'm going to be using internally quite a lot. We do stuff where we generate hundreds and hundreds of applications in a tenant, and we really want a way that we can avoid having those show up during autopilot, because even if they technically aren't required, it still takes time. So if we can figure out a way to avoid the software being hit at autopilot, then that's only good for us.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very exciting.
So one extra thing, Ben, that I want to throw in here that
Mhm.
I just want to call out if people don't realize this with compliance policies. So if we go up to the to an Intune portal,
Yep.
and I'm burying this at the end, I know. If we
Mm.
go to devices and we go to compliance policies and we select the Win10 one and we go to properties. And if we go to edit actions for non-compliant and hit edit on that for me. So right now we have a marked device non-compliant as 120 days. 120 days, crazy, right? But what you can actually do is do 0.3 as an example for 8 hours instead of waiting for
Oh,
a full day.
okay, that's cool. Yeah, because I just thought by default it was 24 hours.
Yeah, no. So you can use. So if you go to the line above it, is the one you want to use.
Oh, we want to modify this one?
Yep. And you change that to 0.5. Remove the second line that you added,
Yep.
and that's going to save and not be a problem.
That's
So
cool.
that will say after 12 hours, it can be marked as non-compliant.
Mhm.
So that grace period is super important when
Yeah,
you're getting a new device. It will go through the whole process to make the device compliant, BitLocker, and everything associated. If you don't
yeah,
have that, then how do you get the policies, etc.?
exactly. And also the key thing that we said earlier, especially going through that case statement, is that for that 12 hours, it's going to be set to unknown
That's
uh,
correct.
or unprocessed, or I can't even remember what it is. I think it's
Unknown.
unknown.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
and there's actually a field inside the managed device object that says grace period time, and it'll tell you when the grace period expires.
exactly. But yeah, so it's a nice, easy one for you. Hopefully you liked the short video. I know I do.
Yep.
Being at the end of the day. But yeah, so again, if anyone's got any cool ideas that we can sort of add to this, please let us know. Again, we'll put a link to the code below, and just yeah, have fun.
Yep.
That's all I got.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Ben.